welcome to Sacred Justice, a podcast that features discourse rooted in the pursuit of justice as sacred practice. Our weekly discussions reflect on current events, art, media, theology, and how they intersect with the movements for freedom and liberation. We hope that through these conversations, we can foster inclusivity by expanding our learning opportunities. We hope to cultivate digital community beyond the confines of our campus. And we hope to reconnect the church's social and spiritual callings. Join us for the journey. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sacred Justice. Sacred Justice is our new podcast that will feature discourse rooted in the pursuit of justice as sacred practice. Our weekly discussions will reflect on current events, art, media, theology, and how this intersects with the movements for freedom and liberation. We hope that through these conversations, we can foster inclusivity by expanding our learning opportunities. We hope to cultivate digital community beyond the confines of our campus. And we hope to reconnect the church's social and spiritual callings. I am Mia McLean, and I am here with
Ben Boswell.
Let's get into it, Ben.
Yeah, we're coming to you today from Catawba land, and we acknowledge the Catawba people, the people of the river, the host people of this land, and we give our gratitude to them for being good stewards of this land on which we live and worship and come to you from to do this podcast. Excited to be here for this new podcast, Mia.
Yes, I'm excited as well. As we've been talking about, Ben and I, we are beginning again. We are beginning lots of things again. This whole year, past 14 months, we've had to begin again over and over. And so this is the theme and the topic for today's podcast. And I'm sort of stealing it from the title of Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr.'s most recent book, Begin Again, which, Ben, you have quoted in sermons a lot. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I'm all about that Eddie Glaude book. I mean, I'm all about James Baldwin, so I'll read anything. And Eddie's also amazing, but anytime somebody writes on James Baldwin, I will be reading that. And it's a great book on James Baldwin, and a great follow-up. I've been, recommending it as a follow-up for folks after they go through the course that we created to kind of take them to the next steps after they've read some Baldwin, to go read this book by Eddie Glaude. So and I love the concept that he comes up with of Begin Again.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking that we are in the season of Easter, post-resurrection, where we are beginning again in many ways, not in terms of the lectionary or the liturgical calendar, the traditional liturgical calendar, but post-resurrection, you think about the stories of Jesus and his followers having to begin their movement again. And so this is the season that we're in. I feel like a lot of us are post-resurrection. We're post-crucifixion, the pandemic crucifixion. We are just starting to get glimpses of hope, resurrection hope. And so now we are heading into this season of beginning.
Well, I don't want to have to quote for myself here, but in my Easter sermon, I talked a lot about how reform is not the answer. Resurrection is the answer. That actually, that was Palm Sunday. Reform is not the answer that God provides, or that the narrative life of Jesus provides to the problems of the world. Resurrection is the answer to the problems of the world, not reform. Jesus doesn't reform anything, right? It's all resurrection. And so I think that's an epistemological shift that Christians sometimes need to make, because we get really, really passionate about reform and gradual change, and or changing things. I like to think about it as controlled change. You know how you can do a controlled burn,
controlled demolition.
We want controlled change. I'm in control of this change. Of course, that's not really how change happens. It's often chaotic and disruptive. But we're looking toward resurrection. We're looking toward new creation, Paul's language for resurrection. I think that it's a really good season for us to start something new. So, I mean, it's amazing to me how we're beginning not only this new podcast in the season of Easter, which is the season of new beginnings, but we're also in this moment of America being made new, hopefully, it's actually maybe more like America is clear. It's now clear America needs to begin again, to use God's language. And we're also in this moment of like, we have no choice but to begin again because of COVID. And it's like, we're not going back to normal. We're refusing the desire to go back to normal. That sort of nostalgia for normality. We're trying to figure out what the new world is that we're walking into, that COVID has given us.
Yeah. Yeah. This new world, a whole new world.
Oh my, are we going to get some singing on this podcast?
You said art. Now you wrote that part into the description. It's art and music and things. So I'm just trying to give people,
all right. I'll take the blame for that. But
yes.
I mean, when you come out singing Aladdin right out of the gate, I mean, we're going to definitely have to deal with pop culture and all that stuff.
Yep. Speaking of, so part of this podcast, we are working in a new section called News and Culture. So that could be anything from reflecting on latest news stories, which there are plenty, or maybe a movie you watched, or something that shook your theological imagination as we sit with sacred justice, doing the work of justice and sacred practice. And so, Ben, is there anything that you have seen the past week? I mean, is there anything? What have you seen? What do you want to talk about with what you've seen? Because there's so much. So,
well, I want to say here that we hope that this will become a spot where people will send recommendations to us of like cultural things that they want us to talk about, a movement, a movie, a TV show, an album, music, art, a phenomenon, that's happening, and we will wrestle with it. Mia will probably already have wrestled with it on Twitter, and we'll just bring it here. But we'll try to do our best to stay current in this with what we talk about, and so send us your recommendations. But for me right now, I am in this. I don't know. I guess I would say, Mia, and this is such a white privilege statement, but I just don't have space right now to contain the violence in my brain. I'm usually all over that. Like, I want to know the names of every victim of every mass shooting. I want to make sure I'm up on every name of every person who's been killed by police, every person of color being killed by police. And right now I can't. There's so much, I can't hold it all in the same space. I don't have enough space emotionally or even intellectually to contain the amount of data I'm having to process through as we're having a mass shooting every other day or every day, sometimes twice a day right now. We got Indianapolis. You mentioned Shreveport this morning. There was another one. They're just happening. And I can't even keep up with and remember that the thing about that is so interesting is we didn't have it during the pandemic. There was this gap of no mass shootings for a while. And it was such a blessing.
At least not major ones, Ben, because we have to remember that a mass shooting is like 4 or more people are shot.
Yeah.
And so maybe it was happening, but certainly at a smaller number. I mean, so far what I've read online, we've had like 135 in 2020. I mean, 2021. 2021, there's been 135 mass shootings.
Which means there's more than one a day, right?
Yeah.
We haven't had 132 days yet this year, have we? I don't know. I'm guessing.
I mean, 90? Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah.
I mean, we're averaging more than one a day, which is worse than it was before the pandemic. And I think so. One of the things that raises up for me is we have to talk about what kind of new beginnings do we care about and that we want to nourish, because we have monstrous new beginnings and we have holy new beginnings. And this is a monstrous new beginning, or you might even call this a return to normal, a new beginning of what we already had, which is a society that is bent on its own destruction through violence here. So I'm really having a hard time containing all that, since it's happening every day, sometimes twice a day. And I'm still continuing to try to process through, all the police killings as well, and the names of all the police killings and the situations and the distinctions between the situations. which sometimes is an exercise in futility. You know, did this person turn away? Did this person get in their car? I mean, the bottom line is that a police officer shot and killed a person at a routine traffic stop or serving a warrant, and they didn't get to go home to their families. And then there's that guy, you know, the white guy who trapped a police officer with his arm in the car and drove off and ended up at the police station totally fine without a scratch on his body. And so to me, again, illustration of the asymmetrical violence and the asymmetrical police warfare on Black and brown bodies I'm carrying that and trying to process through that.
And that reform is, you know, sometimes what comes out of these things is, oh, we're going to add a body camera, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And it proves to not really mean anything because people are still dying.
Right.
And people who are killing are still not being convicted. Or, you know, I'm not a fan or advocating for the carceral system, but we see the inconsistencies. And so that brings me to my news/culture story, because I don't know if you've seen this video on Twitter of this. I think it's a lamb that is stuck in a ditch or something. And a kid is trying to pull the lamb out of this ditch. It's like this really long gaping hole in a street somewhere.
Okay.
So the kid gets the sheep or the lamb free. And we'll call it lamb. The lamb bounces out and starts running away and falls right back into the ditch. And I thought, what an amazingly unfortunate metaphor for this work that we do called justice. It just sort of feels like we are pulling people out of ditches, and we're wrestling them out. We're feeding the hungry and clothing the homeless. In many ways, the system is so broken that they go right back into the ditch, right? Like it needs to be, the whole ground needs to be dug up. Like the whole thing needs to be turned over, burned down. And so I was just sitting with that today. Of course, everybody was laughing on Twitter about it because it's such a funny video. But then, of course, I have to take it to the next level because that's who I am.
Yeah, you find the sermon in the ditch. You find there's always a sermon.
I'm going to preach that later.
You know, I was thinking that's also true of, like, you know, that lamb metaphor could be a metaphor for also for white people or for America, right? It's like and the Black freedom movement. And it's like, because of white backlash, you know, we do liberation and then we reinvent the ditch. So then we do liberation again, and then we reinvent the ditch again, you know. And I was just thinking about, you know, it's like slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, war on crime, war on drugs, mass incarceration. In there, we throw some redlining, sprinkle in some redlining and restrictive covenants, and we have this. We're just replicating slavery by another name every time we can, through whatever means we can, which is back to your point about reform. So I was talking about this with somebody the other night, and I think it was one of the best conversations I've had about this sort of defund the police, abolish prisons, defund prisons movement. And I think the place that was interesting, because we were on different sides. Like I was saying, I think defund is important. Like we need to think about that. And this person was saying, no, defund is not helpful language, because you're not actually completely defunding the police unless you're abolishing them. And in that case, you might as well just say abolish, because defund and abolish are the same. If you take all the funding away, you're abolishing policing, because you can't do policing without money. Right. You can't do anything without money in a capitalist economy. So it was kind of this like, what are we really saying? Why are we saying defund when we really mean abolish? If what we're saying is reallocation of funds, that's not a good marketing slogan. But if we're saying reallocation, let's say reallocation, you know, because there will leave some semblance of policing in place and some semblance of prisons in place. But if we mean abolish, let's say abolish and not say defund. Let's really mean what we say and say what we mean. But I think one of the best points that the person made, this is where we were able to agree, is if you mean by abolish, you know, we have to get rid of this thing we have and then put something new in its place that does community safety, then I'm for you. But what's the thing? Like we want to know what the thing is that's going to be in place. That's where a lot of people depart ways. But so I think that the thing is that what you're saying, when you get to that point, what you're saying is we need a new beginning because the thing we've got is so rotten, we can't salvage it. You know, you can't put a rotten tomato out in the sun and it's going to get better. You know, it's just going to get more rotten. The tomato is gone. It's done. There's nothing you can do with a rotten tomato. Or to use another example, bad apples, right? You can't redeem a bad apple. You know, even if I don't believe in that whole bad apples theory, but you can't redeem a bad apple. You either got to eat it, put a pie, make it into something else, right? Or throw it away and get something new to eat. You know, so it's this begin again becomes the language that we have to wrestle with. And I think, I know this is maybe another segue, but I think this is the logic of Scripture and the logic of what we see in the divine and sacred work of God in the world is a call always to newness, new creation, whether it be the beginning of the creation out of the chaos, whether it be the new creation, the image of new creation that we have in Isaiah 65, or what we get in Paul with new creation language in 2 Corinthians and Galatians, or what we get in Revelation with a new heaven and the new earth. And it's interesting, I was looking at this, comparing Isaiah 65 and this kind of new creation that Isaiah talks about in Isaiah 65, where I'm about to create new heaven and a new earth, the former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. And then comparing that to like then Revelation and Paul, which are also riffing back on Isaiah, right? So they're riffing off of Isaiah. The one change that I saw this time is that in the New Testament, the language of all shows up. Whereas I don't see that as much in the Hebrew Bible. In Revelation and in Paul, it says all things are being made new. All things are being made new in Revelation. Not just we're going to make a new thing. No. We're not making one new thing. All things are going to be made new. And that's that all that sometimes we don't lean into as people of faith because we're scared of the all.
Yeah. It means that all things have to change. And change is scary. I mean, it's okay for us to isolate change or compartmentalize change. We'll change this little thing over here, like you were saying earlier about controlled demolitions or controlled whatever you were saying.
Fire.
Yeah. Yes. It's one thing. We're going to change this little thing over here, but I'm going to have to change you may have to change everything. And this is a part of beginning again.
Yeah.
I want to give some space for a section of the podcast where we actually reflect on quotes.
Okay.
To have some time to sit with some of the thinkers that we've been reading, who are talking about this very thing. And because we've been sort of floating around this language of change, one of my favorite writers is, well, I would say this. I wouldn't say one of my favorite writers. One of my favorite pieces by this writer is Parable of the Sower. By Octavia Butler. And I've referenced her a couple of times in sermons, I'm sure. She has this beautiful refrain, God is change. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. But that's not the quote that I'm using today. This quote is from the beginning of chapter 3 in her book. And she writes, "We do not worship God. We perceive and attend God. We learn from God. With forethought and work, we shape God. In the end, we yield to God. We adapt and endure. For we are earth seed, and God is change." There's this other one that I want to read from the beginning of chapter 6. Very short. It says, "Drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers."
It's like that sheep.
Yeah. And that's, I will say more later, but I do want to give some space for you to reflect on the work of Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. in that book, Beginning Again. If there's a quote from there that you want to share.
Maybe a little bit longer quote than you had, and no less poetic though, because he's quoting from Baldwin. So I'll read this to frame it, it's kind of the end of Begin Again, right before the conclusion. This is the last paragraph before the conclusion. And he's kind of framing how Baldwin did not necessarily call for a third founding of America. We have folks who say we've had two Reconstructions. We had Reconstruction after the Civil War, which is the first Reconstruction. And we had second Reconstruction, which is the Civil Rights Movement and the changes that happened there. And we are in need, they're saying, of a third Reconstruction. Now, that's not language that Baldwin used. Baldwin used kind of a different, more spiritual metaphor, but I'm going to read that. And this is Glaude writing. Baldwin did not call for a third American founding. Instead, he worked tirelessly for what he called the New Jerusalem. To my mind, there is little difference between the two. Both call for a world and a society that reflect the value that all human life, no matter the color of your skin, your zip code, your gender, who you love, is sacred. In his aftertimes, Baldwin understood that something new was desperately trying to be born, but the old ghosts had the baby by the throat. He wrote in the epilogue to No Name in the Street, "An old world is dying and a new one kicking in the belly of its mother. Time announces that it is ready to be born. This birth will not be easy, and many of us are doomed to discover that we are exceedingly clumsy midwives. No matter, so long as we accept that our responsibility is to the newborn. The acceptance of responsibility contains the key." And then Glaude says, that was 1972. The labor has been long and hard, and the new world has yet to be born. We are now in our aftertimes, but responsibility has not been lost. Whatever happens next will be up to us.
Responsibility.
Responsibility to the newborn. See, this is, I think, what the biblical witness in Scripture, and even I think Butler is trying to teach us, that the responsibility is to the thing that is becoming new. We don't have responsibility to the old that is dying. We have a responsibility to the new that is coming into being. And I heard recently this amazing thing where in Ella's song, the song Ella Baker wrote, which kind of has that chorus, "We who believe in freedom shall not rest." A number of the verses of that song are about the responsibility to the young people in the movement. We believe in the young people, that we will get out of the way and let the young people lead, that we will support the young people. If we can teach something, if we can share some wisdom, we will, but that they are going to do what we couldn't, that they have the potential to go where we wouldn't go, to face things we were too afraid to face. And I think that's also, when we say the responsibility to the new that is coming into being, it's also the responsibility to the next generation that is coming behind us.
Yeah, which sort of brings it back to that, quote from Octavia in that particular chapter about people die, fighting their rescuers. And I just think about, in terms, even in the context of the church, right? That so many churches, I don't think ours is, but so many churches are dying, though we all have the potential, are dying because they are fighting the people who are trying to come in and help and bring new stuff to bring change that's going to be life-saving and life-giving change into our institutions. I mean, even when you look at churches, you look at sort of folks who are in that millennial category and younger struggling to get employed, right? Because we have these people who are generations older, perhaps wiser, maybe not, who are sort of holding on to power. And even when we're talking about this justice issue about police brutality or just about shootings, right? That a lot of the people who are in power are not the people who are the grassroots who are fighting for ontological shifts to be happening. And a lot of them are younger people. They're like 15-year-olds out here, right? 15-year-olds are holding people to the fire, to the flame. And we're not seeing the sort of fast progression because the people in power are comfortable. In many, many ways, the people in power are comfortable.
Yeah, and I think there is a lack of urgency among those in power. And thank God, there is a sense of urgency among many who think that the world may not be there for them when they are my age or, my parents' age. So they're this is why I love the term Extinction Rebellion. I think that is like every social justice movement should take on the terminology Extinction Rebellion, right? It's like, because we are all bent on our own human extinction right now. And we have been about human extinction for a long time. And we have not reckoned with the fact that we are killing ourselves through a whole bunch of different ways, whether it be our economic system, whether it be the racial injustice, the history of white supremacy, I mean, I could go on, environmental injustice, the way we treat women, the way we treat people, same gender loving people, LGBTQ people, trans people. We're just bent on our own destruction, and again, it kind of goes back to that control. We want to control the change.
Yeah.
We don't want to allow change to be. I think I was mentioning this to you on the podcast. There's a podcast called the Emergent Strategy Podcast, and they are very influenced by Butler. And in the beginning, they say, we are about getting in right relationship to change. So they're using like Christian church language.
Reconciliation.
Right? Yeah, we need to be in right relationship with God. You hear that from preachers, but there's, instead of God, they put change. So we need to be in right relationship to change. What does it mean to get in right relationship with change? I think that's just so fascinating. Listening to that has made me really rethink my own faith. Well, Butler has done that a lot for me. And so have indigenous writers and authors have made me rethink the assumptions that I had that were at the foundation of a lot of the doctrines and belief systems that I have as a part of my Christianity that need to be kind of turned over.
Yes. Yes. And that's uncomfortable, right, Ben? So what is it if we shift toward looking at church? What is that discomfort, and how do we walk that fine line between wanting to push toward change and also recognizing that it can be painful, it can be uncomfortable? I'm thinking a lot about, as we begin again as a congregation to come back together in some form, it's going to look different, and some things are going to be different. What is that fine line that we need to walk?
Yeah, I think let me just diagnose the problem first, I think, and then I think maybe we can figure out the line. To me, it's that age-old issue that you've heard a lot, but I think now it is amplified and intensified at the highest level it's ever been. And that is, there is nothing tied down anymore. I don't know if it ever really was tied down, but I mean, imagine we're on a ship and all gravity shifts, right? We're on a spaceship and we go into zero gravity. Everything starts to float. That is life right now. Nothing is tied down. Nothing is magnetized. Nothing is Velcroed down. There's nothing that's tied down. I'm talking nothing. The family, what the family will be, our governmental system, our economic system, the way church works, every aspect of our society, business, eating, drinking, friendship, community, parenting, name it. None of it's tied down. It's all in flux. Some of that is a symptom of post-modernity that we live in, that whatever, I don't even know if that's a real term. I don't know if you can be post anything, but the sort of particular point within modernity that we are in, nothing is tied down. There are no givens anymore, right? Nothing is stable. And so in an arena of radical instability and extraordinary dynamic change, we go to the places that we think we can control. And one of the places that we think we can control is church, because we want to keep it the same. We need something that is somehow familiar to us, so that resounds, that sense of familiarity, the nostalgia for a previous day gone by that seemed simpler with less problems. In fact, it had worse problems in some ways and even more entrenched issues that we were blind to, but we want to go back there because we were blind, right? Ignorance is bliss. So we want to go back to the ignorance of the past, the blissful ignorance of the past, where things were not as complex. Church was not as focused on social justice. People were not dying every day from mass shootings. Everything was not political. Politicians were not as corrupt. Yes, they were, but we imagine they weren't, right? Yeah. So when the world with everything is not tied down, we go to church and we want to tie everything down with chains. I'm talking like chains that you could pull a tugboat with chains, and we chain everything as tightly as we can because it's the only place we have that we think we can control the change in. And the reality is we can't, but we can kill the church faster by grasping onto control and trying to control the change. So that's what's happening all across the world. Bill Leonard just had an article, I think we'll share it in the weekly next week, about how rapidly churches died in COVID. So, we already had 4,500 churches dying a year. So 4,500 churches were dying a year going into COVID. And it was like something like that per month through COVID. It was ridiculous. So, I mean, and a lot of that has to do with, what you and I have struggled with over the last year is like, you can fight technology and try to resist it, but you will lose. It is a losing battle. There is no win. You can't win against that. It's the kind of change that if you resist, you just die, right? So it's sort of like what Octavia is saying is we're the drowning person and technology is coming to save us, or God or whoever, and they have tools with them. Maybe technology is the life raft or whatever, jump onto this floaty so I can bring you, or here's the stick. You know how some of the pools used to have the sticks that they put in, and we are like, no, get that stick out of here. We don't want that. But we just die faster. It doesn't mean we die, but
that brought up something I was thinking about earlier today. As a child of Hurricane Katrina, I watched so many churches. And I'm not talking about churches that literally died because they went underwater and nobody could afford to repair them. I'm not talking about those churches. I'm talking about like the churches I grew up in and some other places that they may not be dead, but they were deflated significantly by Hurricane Katrina, because what that space allowed for some people, these seasons that we are hopefully about to come out of like this often give a lot of people permission to leave and do other things that didn't have permission before. And so the dying is, of course, could be about technology and some other, resistance to change. But I also think some of the death is because it's giving people permission to say, I don't really like that place anyway. Or
why was I going there? Why was I spending all my time there?
Yes. Yeah. Why was I so addicted to being in charge, right? Or whatever their processing is. And so how do they begin again? How do we begin again without them? Because there is a sense of loss in the change. And I don't think everybody is up for the journey. And so then we had to deal with that loss and deal with that grief. And so what is that like? And I know we want to get to the kind of the fine line and how do you do it, but any reflections on that?
Oh man. Yeah. I mean, I think what does intensity prove? It makes you actually, I'd say like a lot of things do this, but intensity, like an intense crisis, makes a lot of things that were priorities that you thought were priorities become less important, or you reshuffle what matters to you. So one of the ways where a lot of people are talking about this is like, if you were a person that was in my life and I didn't need to see you for the whole pandemic and I was still fine, maybe you're not that important a person in my life right now. Like, we're fine. There's people thinking about that in terms of their friends, not like colleagues or something, but like they're friends, right? And people may be thinking about that in terms of church members. But as far as friends are going, if you didn't need to even talk to like pick up the phone and call somebody and talk to them in the pandemic, maybe they are not a person that's, really that important for you at this stage in your journey, in your life, right? I think what happens in the pandemic with these kind of crises is that a lot of our priorities begin to be reshuffled and shifted. So it's real easy to you're out of the habit of going to a place for worship. Now you get in the habit of watching, then you get out of the habit of watching. And now how are you going to come back to it? It's a habitual thing, right? It's about habits and healthy habits and good habits. And we prioritizing the good over the other things that are not so good. And I just think that there are people who maybe weren't that serious about church and maybe didn't really need to be. and they didn't really need it in their life for whatever reason, and they're not coming back, and maybe I think everybody needs church or whatever. That's okay for some people to think that. I don't know if that's true, but I can't force people to reprioritize all their lives now. Maybe there's some people it was really clarifying for them not to be there every week, good or bad. For some, they really missed it and they became even more committed. They're like, this place is amazing. I need this people. Others, for whatever reason, it was like, I wasn't that invested. I thought I was, but I wasn't really, I'm really not that invested. It's a clarifying thing. COVID has been clarifying and intensifying, and it's also reprioritized things in our lives. Yeah. So what are we talking about? The line between what?
Yes, the line. So I'm getting there. So I'm learning to have grace with people as they journey, with myself, with others, as they journey through these clarifying conversations that they're trying to have. And so then I'm trying to practice that same grace when we are talking about this line that we must walk when we're really trying to push change or push a new beginning, but also wanting to take people with us and not leave them behind. So I could talk for myself. It's a constant learning process for me because I will move at the speed of light. Like, let's get this done. What's taking you so long? But then I can do that and then I can be at my destination by myself. Is that really worth it? So any reflections on what that line is for you, or what that line could be for churches, for people of faith who are trying to also have this forward movement, who also want to begin again, but don't want to leave folks behind if they don't have to?
Yeah, I think, it's hard because, as Baldwin points out, and this is true not only of America, but of church as well, and our own lives actually too, our own soul work, is we have to be primarily responsible to the new that is emerging and not the old. And that makes us, I think as clergy, we have to be. We have no choice. If we don't, then we're part of the architecture of death. But so it's hard. Sometimes people will talk. I feel like I'm at cognitive dissonance with people because they'll say, well, why don't you care about this as much as I do? And I'll say, it's not that I don't care. It's that I've had to make a commitment to be more responsible to the new that is coming into being, and the new world, the new birth, the new creation, because that is a calling. That's my calling. And that's also what I think Baldwin calls us to in America. I think that's what Christ calls us to. I think what God is doing through the Bible. And I think that's actually what Butler means in being in right relationship with change. To be in right relationship with change is to be taking responsibility for the new that is coming into the world, the new being that's coming, the change that's coming in, and figuring out how to be in relationship to the change. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean all change is good. This is where people get caught up, right? Good is a strange word, but like, it's not all going to feel good. Right.
Yeah.
And it might not feel like it might feel like the kind of thing we want to resist, and so that's where we got to figure out how to get in right relationship to the change that's coming. Either the change is something we might need to resist, or it might be something that we need to figure out how to roll with. So there's a lot to wrestle with there, sort of philosophically, but particularly within an organization, when it's all of us together, individual people should be given the freedom to take as much responsibility for their own lives as they want, right? We got to give them that freedom. And that's why personal responsibility is never going to be the answer to the world's problems, because how do you hold people accountable? You can't make that a mandate. You can hold organizations and institutions accountable to a different set of goals and strategies and guiding principles, and that's where our churches comes in. If we were just running a number of individual lives, if you gave us, we could give people different plans. You're on the slow change plan, like a cell phone plan, right? You sign up for $100 a year, and you get the slow change plan. You keep giving, you're participating, and we let you experience the world as slow and as familiar as you want. And then we have the middle plan, which is kind of like a little bit of change, but not too much that it's overwhelming. And then we have like high speed plan.
I need high speed.
Yeah. And so, but the problem is churches don't offer plans. We don't offer a variety of plans. We're not a service provider, right? Who can offer you buy this much internet or this much speed or whatever, or this much roaming data or, cloud space or whatever. We're trying to do what God's work in the world. We got one plan,
Yeah.
and we're trying to make sure as many people can come along with it. But at the same, I still think the principle of change management always holds true. And that is that there's always going to be 20% of people in your congregation who are going to go along with everything you're doing because they're sold out on the institution and you. And then there's always 20% of people in a congregation who are going to fight everything you do because they're not even sure they should be there. And they want everything to stay the way it always has been. They're the control folks. And then there's 60% of the people in the middle could go kind of one way or the other. They're not sure. They're still trying to figure it all out. And to me, it's like, you always want to worry about the 60. The 60 is the people to worry about, right? You don't want to worry about the 20 who are always with you. They can't make all the decisions for everybody. The 20 who are always against you, you can't let them determine everything for everybody. You got to work with the 60 who are trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. And they're not always going to be, sometimes need some convincing and some persuasion and some conversation and dialogue. And so, you get to 60 and now you got 80 because you got the 20 that were already agreeing with you. And then you can kind of move a church forward. But I do think it takes time. And, but I think it starts with that commitment. I mean, if we're not talking to one another on the same plane, if we're not both committed to the new thing God is doing, if we're committed to the old thing God did in the past, and I'm talking about the new thing, you and I are never going to talk.
Yeah.
Right. I remember one of my first sermons here, I asked, actually I'm not even sure it was in a sermon. Maybe I did. I think it was the first sermon I preached. I said, are we more in love? Are our dreams, wait a second. How did I say it? Are our dreams about the past bigger than our dreams about the future? So, for instance, when folks in our church look back at the past, it's like the glory days of Marnie and Owens. It's also the glory days of when church all over the world was amazing, especially in America. It was like the Iron Age. Bill Leonard calls it the Iron Age of church because they were building a church on every block for years and years and years. And it was interesting. Gene Owens' tenure, who was our third senior minister, his tenure ended at the apex of the beginning of church decline.
Wow.
So like he comes to the end of his 20-year tenure. He's the third senior minister in the church's history. And at the end of his tenure is one of the years where they start to track rapid church decline, right? This is mid to late 90s, right? And that's when everything from there, everything goes crazy from there. And it's just been worse every year since then. So when we look back at the glory days, we look back at the time of Owens and we see this, grand thing, thousands of people in worship and stuff like that. And it was just, we were also a reflection of a cultural moment, not just doing great things ourselves. And so sometimes our dreams about the past are bigger than what we can imagine for the future. And I think we have to dream bigger for the future than when we look back in the past.
Ben, as we begin to wrap up and think about what is it like, and we're going to be continuing these conversations about beginning again. So this won't be the last one, and I have some special guests up my sleeve, but I do want to talk a little bit about a theological reflection. You talked a lot about new creation and some of the scriptural references that help ground you as a leader, as a spiritual leader, especially as we go toward change. And one of the things that I live by is Genesis 1. I mean, I will preach it until the day I die, probably. But there's this idea that the conversation continues. And I think that particularly people of faith have difficulty with this because it sort of challenges the text a little bit. To say that after day 7, that there was other days that happened after that matter. But that's sort of the theology that grounds me, that we were all given permission to say, let there be with God. over and over again. And I think for so many church folk, it's like, no, God stopped at day 7. So, that's it. That's it. We're not, or senior minister emeritus stopped at day 7, or whoever was in, whoever is part of their mythology, of a space, no, that was them. They had the power. And I sort of feel like when you were talking earlier about people taking responsibility, there's a sort of way that people shy away from that kind of responsibility. They want to be in charge of various things, but they don't want to say, let there be, necessarily. Many people don't.
No, they don't. I was reflecting as you were about how interesting it is to me. I always bring this up, but that Genesis was written in the exile. Now, some of the stories may have existed in oral form, but when it was written down, that means when they decided which stories go in what order and how the chapters are laid out and how it begins. And isn't it interesting that in the middle of exile, while you are being oppressed by either the Assyrians or the Babylonians, you're in exile, you're being oppressed by a foreign empire, that you write a creation story where all people are created in the creation story, and it's not just Israel. Because those creation stories that were created were the foundation of how a nation was made, not all of humanity. So they tell a story about all of humanity. And then the birth of Israel comes later in Genesis, right? The story of the birth of the community is it's a calling, right? A calling out of the empire. So the Genesis story is, first of all, it's an egalitarian story of that all people are made in the image of God, regardless of what nationality. That's a beautiful thing right out of the gate, right? But the fact that they wrote that in exile, to me, it's like, even though we think of Genesis as the beginning, it was really a new beginning because it was being written in exile. And they were saying, this is how we want to start again. This is how we want to begin again, is with a new thought about how we are all really connected. And then Israel was created in this way, but we're all human beings. We're all united in that humanity as being created by God. And we're going to begin again with that story while we're sitting here in exile, being oppressed. To me, there's something beautiful about that. And similar to kind of how it's very similar to the way in which people of color are calling America to begin again in the midst of occupation, in the midst of oppression, saying we got to start over. Because we don't undersee each other's humanity right now. We're not treating each other as, let alone as Americans, certainly not even as humans. Yeah. And so that's why we got to start over.
Yeah. Oh, that piece, beginning again in exile. That is so, I'm going to chew on that. I'm going to chew on that for next episode. Beginning again in exile. Yes. Listen, Ben, this was a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, it was fun. I'm glad we're getting started with this podcast. This is so fun.
We're excited to take you all on this journey, and we are open to your feedback and thoughts. So if you have any questions or comments, please email me, Mia McLean. You can email me at mmmcclain@myersparkbaptist.org. Let me know your thoughts, and we'd love to incorporate them into our episodes. Until next time, thank you. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Friends, that was our episode this week. As always, please email your questions and your suggestions to Reverend Mia McLean at mmmcclain@myersparkbaptist.org. Until next time, take care. This is Sacred Justice.